All right, so welcome to those online. I want to continue where we left off yesterday for those that would have been in the room yesterday with today's lecture. And so we left off with this notion that essentially what the Supreme Court rules in 1954 in Brown versus Board of Education is that separate but equal is inherently unequal. And you don't need to write this slide down. This is just a little bit of sort of detail for you. There is massive resistance to Brown versus Board of Education in the South, right? For the record, the Supreme Court is nothing more than 9 men and women in black robes who literally throw open the doors and make pronouncements. Segregation is unconstitutional. Thank you. It's all they do. They can't enforce it. They rely upon governors and mayors and police chiefs and president and Congress to enforce the rulings they make. The Supreme Court literally has no ability to enforce its own rulings. It seriously is 9 people in robes, right, who just declare crap. And so down in the South, after Brown says, listen, school segregation is unconstitutional and schools must desegregate with all deliberate speed, there is massive resistance in the South to this. 80% of Southern whites are against the Brown decision. Whites actually will begin refuse to attend integrated schools. We see a sharp reemergence of the Klan. And by the way, just to show you what I mean by resistance to Brown, a whole bunch of Southern states just throw up their middle fingers and go, come get us, Supreme Court. We ain't segregating. You're not going to tell us what to do down here in Virginia. Virginia actually decided in response to Brown versus Board, it would just simply cut off money to any schools that attempted to integrate. Well, how long can a school operate if it doesn't have funding? Yeah, not very, right? And so Virginia goes, we were supposed to integrate? Cool. And Jeffco, if you go integrate, no problem. We're cutting you off, right? Or we're cutting off your funding. Whites that had the means could have just gone out to private schools. But for most blacks in Virginia, this meant literally school was shut down entirely. So this kind of comes to a head in 1957 in Little Rock, Arkansas. This is sort of the deep, deep South now, okay? And so let me kind of highlight what you want to write down here. I don't know why that's writing in red, but Little Rock 9. Let me tell you what I want you to know here. In 1957, so we're about 3 years after Brown versus Board of Education, actually about 2.5 years after Brown versus Board. Remember, spring of 1954, the Supreme Court declares school segregation is unconstitutional. Schools must desegregate with, quote, all deliberate speed. Now here we are 2.5 years later. And Little Rock, Arkansas decides it's going to integrate its largest high school, Central High School. Now, let's talk about what Central High School is. Central High School is kind of like, in our brain, Cherry Creek. It's huge. It's about 3,000 students. And it's not just big, it's also one of the best high schools in the nation. To this day, you've all seen like US News and World Report ranks colleges and that kind of stuff, right? To this day, in the year 2021, there is still a US News and World Report ranking of the best high schools in America. And Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas still makes that list.
From Arkansas so stupid?
Well, they're from Arkansas, right? Probably inbreeding. No, just kidding for those listening. It's not. No, but they decide this is a good school. This is not some, school that they want to integrate. This is literally a school that offers programs that, your home school might not. This is Cherry Creek, right? Cherry Creek offers AP Japanese. No kidding, right? Well, in 1957, Little Rock, Arkansas's Central High School is much like that. It's this desirable school that everybody wants to go to. It's big, but it offers things that almost no other school can. And the school district announces a plan to essentially integrate blacks into this otherwise all white Cherry Creek High School. Eventually, 9 students are selected. If I remember correctly, the story, the spring before the school year starts, the school board sort of does like, all right, we're going to take applications, right, from black families that want to try to integrate into Central High School. Through the process, there's some intimidation, families drop out, as sort of there's threats and so forth and intimidations. Finally, it gets down to there's these 9 students, I think 2 seniors, 3 juniors, I think 3 sophomores and 1 freshman, okay, who are going to integrate Central High School. Now we get to the beginning of the school year. It's August 1957. The night before the school year starts, the Arkansas governor calls in the National Guard, not to help these 9 students get into the building, to physically prevent them from getting into the building. Eisenhower, this goes on for 3 weeks. Every day for 3 weeks, these 9 black students show up at Central High School, attempt to attend classes, are physically blocked by fully armed National Guardsmen from entering the building, and they get back in the car and they go home. This goes on for the first 3 weeks of school. Finally, in late September, President Eisenhower sends 10,000 federal troops to Little Rock Central High School for the purpose of getting these 9 black kids in. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine showing up to go to the high school, and when you come on campus, there are 10,000 fully armed federal troops in the bus lane to make sure that 9 minority students can enter our building. That's exactly what happens here. And by the way, it's not just 10,000 random federal troops. Eisenhower calls in the 101st Airborne Division. If you've ever heard of the Screaming Eagles, that's who he sends, right? I just want you to imagine this. There is this much resistance. Brown versus Board says school desegregation is wrong and must fall, and schools must desegregate. 2.5 years later, it takes the President of the United States sending troops so that 9 kids can attend Cherry Creek High School, right? For the remainder of the year, each of these 9 had a federal troop assigned to them to sort of walk them into classes. So for the remainder of that school year, the 10,000 are gone, but there's a handful of fully armed federal troops escorting 9 black students from when you get into the building to biology class, and then from biology to history class, and so on. The next school year, this is how much resistance there is in the South. Little Rock decides to close its schools, period. So this would be like if Jeffco said, all right, that's enough. There's no school next year. We're shutting it all down. Okay, we're shutting it all down. If Jeffco just simply said, rather than integrate our schools, we're just shutting it down. So next year in Jeffco, 85,000 students have nowhere to go. Okay, sounds kind of fun to some degree, but that's not what's happening here. The white students can sort of go off into the burbs and attend private schools. The black students had nowhere to go. Okay, in fact, the freshman of the 9 lives in our community. She lives down in Greenwood Village. Her name is Carlotta Lanier. We've had her here at Golden High School to speak a couple of years ago. I think the last time we had her here, you guys were 8th graders. We rounded up all the sophomores in the auditorium, and the youngest, the freshman of the 9, talked to us about her experience, right? And she said that year, the year that would have been her sophomore year, that Little Rock Central Schools decided to close down, her family decided to sort of get out of the pressure cooker, and they took a vacation. They came up to Colorado, and they enjoyed it here. So the next year, the Supreme Court forced the reopening of Little Rock Central High School, so she went back to school. She graduated a year early in what would have been her junior year, and she went to college up at Michigan State University. I think this would have been 1960, 61. She went up to Michigan State University, but she told us when we were talking with her that she found that Michigan State was every bit as racist as it was down in Arkansas. So she unenrolled after her freshman year in Michigan State University. She remembered how much she enjoyed Colorado. So she applied to what at that time was called Colorado Teachers College. Today it's called the University of Northern Colorado, UNC. So she came out to go finish her college at UNC, met her husband, and they settled here in Denver. And for the last 50, 60 years, she's lived on the south side of Denver, down by Greenwood Village, Englewood, sort of thing. She's a real estate agent, believe it or not. She's hard to get to come talk to us because February is Black History Month. So she spends all of her time traveling around, speaking and doing Oprah and all of those things. She is incredibly cool. At the end of this lecture, because I don't want to do it right now, I'll show you her picture and so forth. She's like in the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame. She's just amazing. She's amazing. And it's just amazing to hear. But let me tell you this really fast because this was enjoyable. When we had her here, one of the students during the Q&A asked, what do your children think of this? Because now she's got children and grandchildren. What do your children think of this? And she told this amazingly cool little story where she said that she actually didn't tell her kids. Her kids stumbled upon it. She said her son came home from school one day, when he was in high school. Her children probably are my age-ish, right? Maybe a little older than me. Her son came home from school one day, from high school, slid his history textbook in front of his mom and went, "That looks like you." And she goes, "Yeah, so let me tell you." I was like, wow, in a day and age where we slap everything we do up on social media, look at me, look at me, look at me, look at me. This woman was part of the most amazing moment in American history, one of the most amazing moments in American history. She's so humble, she didn't even tell her own son, her own children about it until they discovered it in a class like this. Pretty friggin' amazing, right? I love it. So I'm not going to go deeper into the story of Little Rock 9. I haven't told you guys this yet, but in 2 weeks, instead of a test over this unit or an assessment, you're gonna do a small research project on one of the topics and dig into it a little bit further. For now, I just want you to know about the Little Rock crisis. This is the kind of resistance that exists in the South. 10,000 federal troops so that 9 kids can attend a high school. Oh, and by the way, that has to be repeated. In 1961, one black guy by the name of James Meredith attempts to enroll in Ole Miss, Mississippi State University. The president at that time is John F. Kennedy. And President Kennedy has to do the exact same thing, send federal troops to Ole Miss so that one black guy can walk on that campus and enroll in a class. Isn't that amazing? Right? That's where we are with the amount of resistance to this. What's that?
And then he got shot in the head.
Yes, no, Kennedy, yeah. Actually, that'll be the thing after the week after we do the research project, Kennedy's assassination is what we're going to do. All right, so that brings us to the Montgomery bus boycott. Now, again, this is, you all know this story to some degree because this is Rosa Parks. December 1955, Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat in the middle section of a bus for a white man. Now, by the way, let me kind of correct the record here. Most Americans know the Rosa Parks story incorrect. And it's not because Americans are dumb, though we are. It's because your teachers just aren't as smart as me. The teachers that you've had, right, just aren't as smart as me. So let me tell you, somebody tell me what happened to Rosa Parks. What do y'all know about Rosa Parks? Tell me the story.
She went on the bus.
Right.
Refused to give up her seat, and then that's all.
Okay, she sits down.
Yeah, that's all the river.
Right, white man gets on the bus, and she goes, "I'm not getting up." That's kind of the gist we all know, right? Okay, that's part of the story. Here's the actual way it went down. This is Alabama. Alabama's segregation law said this: blacks, when Rosa Parks gets on a bus, if there's not a single white man on the bus, she can sit anywhere on the bus that she wants. Okay, so when Rosa Parks gets on the bus, there's no whiteys there. There's no whiteys there. Okay, so she sits down. Then, if at some future stop a white man comes onto the bus, then all of a sudden the bus turns into like a black section and a white section. So in other words, if there's no whites, the whole bus is the black section. But when a white person gets in, the front half of the bus becomes the white section, the back half becomes the black section. While Rosa Parks, when she gets on the bus initially, there's no whites. So she takes a seat in the front half of the bus. At a later stop, a white man gets on the bus. At this point, by law, Rosa Parks is supposed to get up and vacate that port of the bus to the back half or the black half of the bus. That's what she refuses to do. It's not that she wouldn't give up her seat for a black man. I think that's kind of what most people know. It's not that the bus is full and this white man needs a seat and I'm refusing to get up. No, there were plenty of seats. He's the only black or white guy on the bus. There's plenty of seats. It's that she refused to vacate the entire half of the bus, right? So a couple of stops later, the bus driver, and by the way, Rosa Parks and the bus driver had a conflict about this a couple of weeks prior, so there was a little bit of history there. Well, a couple of stops later, the bus driver comes to a stop. There happens to be a Montgomery police officer there, and he opens the door and says, "All right, she's making trouble again," and she gets arrested. Okay, she gets arrested. Now, that's the Rosa Parks story, but I want to tell you the piece that most of y'all probably never heard about this. Montgomery, Alabama happens to be the home community of a local pastor by the name of Martin Luther King. Okay? There's a boycott that is organized. Specifically a boycott of the bus system. Okay? And we're taking notes here. A boycott of the bus system. And this boycott is going to become led by a little known Montgomery, Alabama pastor by the name of Martin Luther King. Now listen, this is 1955. If you live outside of Montgomery, Alabama, you have never heard the name Martin Luther King. Okay? He is not this giant of the civil rights movement that you and I know. In 1955, he's literally my pastor in Arvada. I attended church in Old Town Arvada. Pastor's name is Jay Pathak. Unless you live in Arvada, you would have never heard of this man, right? Show of hands, how many of you have heard of my pastor's name? None of you. But if you live in Arvada, particularly in sort of the eastern side of Arvada, you know my pastor's name, just because our church is very active in Arvada. We provide a homeless shelter for Arvada's homeless during the cold nights of the winter and so on. The mayor knows our pastor's name. The police chief knows our, right? My point is that if you live in Arvada, you know the name of my pastor. Well, in 1955, if you live in Montgomery, Alabama, you've probably heard the name Martin Luther King. But if you don't live in Alabama, you don't live in Montgomery, you've not heard this guy's name. He is simply a local Baptist minister. It's the Rosa Parks thing that is going to springboard Martin Luther King into national prominence. Within 3 years, the whole nation knows this man's name. Okay. It just so happens that Rosa Parks gets arrested in the hometown of an activist preacher, pastor that nobody knows outside of his town. This boycott drags on for over a year. Okay. Yeah, sorry. And if you need to shift, I have to kind of keep this popped up like that. So I know it's so annoying. But this boycott goes on for 400 days. And the Supreme Court, December 20th, 1956, declares segregation on public transportation is unconstitutional. By the way, let me make that point really fast. When the Supreme Court declares school segregation in Brown versus Board unconstitutional, that left untouched segregation in other parts of life. The Supreme Court can only rule on things before it, right? Brown versus Board was specifically about the issue of school segregation. So you want to think of like the falling of Jim Crow, like the falling of dominoes. The first domino to fall is school segregation in Brown versus Board of Education. The next domino to fall is a year and a half later, okay, 2 years later, in this ruling about the Rosa Parks Montgomery bus boycott incident. Now, for our purposes, there's the interesting little story about Rosa Parks, and you all heard some version of that. But why I want this to stick in your brain is this is the moment right here where a little known pastor named Martin Luther King sort of springboards to national prominence. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about Martin Luther King. Is anybody that needs this slide up still? I see. You sure? Yeah. Okay, good. Everybody good? Okay, cool. So Rosa Parks gets arrested. The community comes together and decides to have a boycott. That boycott lasts for 400 days, over a year. And it's being led by this little known pastor. Again, this is 1955, 1956. Nobody outside of Montgomery, Alabama knows this guy's name yet. Okay. But very quickly, he's going to become a leader in the national civil rights movement. So let's talk a little bit about Martin Luther King. Okay. And really, to be truthful, there's only a few things here that I care that you know. He's a Baptist minister from Montgomery, Alabama, right? And this is what I care right here, that he preaches a particular kind of civil disobedience known as nonviolent resistance. Now, I don't know if we'll get to it today, but we will next week, because his call for nonviolent resistance is going to get picked up nationwide. And within just a few years of the Montgomery bus boycott, this little known pastor who's preaching nonviolence will become sort of the philosophical leader of movements all through the country. By 1960, you get what are called sit-ins, breaking out in colleges in North Carolina and South Carolina and so forth, where quite literally Black students would go sit at a coffee counter or a lunch counter at which they couldn't legally sit because of segregation laws. White cop billy clubbing said customer in the head, being dragged out bloody. And what does America see? Violent white Jim Crowist, peaceful, non-violent protester getting beaten with a billy club simply for asking for a cup of coffee. Here's the genius of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King recognized the power of images. Martin Luther King recognized that that same screen you and I watched I Love Lucy on last week could be used not just to get a laugh, but to let white Northerners see the violence that holds Jim Crow in place. Let's be really clear. Little Linda Brown doesn't attend her blacks only school simply because the law says so. And well, that's the law. I'll just follow it. No, Jim Crow is backed up and enforced by unspeakable amounts of violence. And what Martin Luther King recognized is that if we do nonviolent resistance to Jim Crow and let these new things called TV cameras be there to see it, and now here you are, Whitey McWhite, living up in Minneapolis. Listen, if I live in Minneapolis, I've never actually seen the violence of Jim Crow. Yesterday, if you watched lecture, I told the quick story of Emmett Till, a 13-year-old black kid who goes down to Mississippi from Chicago, goes down to Mississippi, sexually advances on a white woman, and is beaten so severely he's not even recognizable as human. I'll show you the picture in a little while. Has a radiator tied around his neck with barbed wire and is thrown into a river where his body's found a few days later. That's the kind of violence that happens. And you know what he did to get that? He either whistled at a white woman or brushed against her hand in some way. Give me a second. What Martin Luther King understood, let me finish this sentence, then I'm coming. What Martin Luther King understood is that Jim Crow isn't just laws that say, black girl, there's your school. That those laws, those social policies, those customs are backed up with tremendous amounts of unspeakable violence. And what Martin Luther King is really brilliant for, yeah, he's a nice orator, he gives great speeches, but what he's really smart about is he goes, wait a minute, you up in the North ain't seen this kind of stuff, right? That, listen, blacks make up 13% of the population. You gonna make a whole lot of change if you're only 13% of the population? No. What Martin Luther King understood is whites need to be on board, particularly Northern whites. Northern whites have to actually have our backs here. And what Martin Luther King understood is if we let Northern whites see nonviolent resistance to the brutality of Jim Crow on their TV while they're living their nice little white suburban lives in Minneapolis or Detroit or Boston or Chicago or Cleveland, well, then maybe whites will just be pissed off enough to get on board. All right, sorry, there were some comments. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, so the lady that accused Emmett Till of sexually harassing or whatever came out 10 or 15 years ago and said they never actually touched her in any way.
Right.
They brushed past each other in a little gas station.
Yep.
And then she called her husband or whatever on him.
And her husband was a local Klansman.
And the husband and I think it was 15 other guys did what they did.
Yep. Yeah, she just before she died, I think you're right, about 10, 15 years ago, she recanted and said it never happened. But it doesn't matter. Emmett Till becomes the symbol of Jim Crow violence, right? And for those in the room, I'll show you his mom, when Emmett Till was found, his mom requested an open casket funeral for the same reason that Martin Luther King wants Whitey McWhite up in Minneapolis to see what violence looks like in Jim Crow South. Mom wants an open casket funeral. And the picture of Emmett Till in his open casket was published in almost every newspaper in the land. And it's one of the first times Whitey McWhite, would have gotten to see this, right? This otherwise routine violence, right? What happened to Emmett Till is only remarkable because his mom decided to have pictures taken of it. That's it. The only reason you know his name. Otherwise, he becomes a faceless, nameless victim of Jim Crow, right? Like millions before him. Go ahead.
You already said the thing.
Oh, what were you going to say? I'm sorry.
I was going to say when his mom had a
Right. And to her credit, when you see the picture, and I'm not going to show it to you at this moment simply because it takes too long to stop sharing a screen and share a screen and whatever. So I'll find it. Those that are watching online, if you just open a tab and Google, Emmett Till, T-I-L-L, and do casket and go to images, you'll see it. It's one of the most famous photos in our nation's history, unfortunately. But where Emmett Till's mother and Martin Luther King collide is they both recognize the power of imagery. That's it, right? That if I'm a whitey up north, I've just never seen that kind of Jim Crow violence. All I've ever heard is blacks complain they're not equal down in the South. I've never actually seen with my own eyes, right, the violence it takes to hold Jim Crow and segregation in place. And that is Martin Luther King's real genius, okay? Now, the rest of this, I don't care. We'll talk about later. Again, the purpose of this lecture is to give you a very broad overview. If you're interested in digging into Martin Luther King and his ideas and philosophies and his influence in the social justice movement of the civil rights movement, you'll have an opportunity to do that. Again, I'm not, you'll notice I'm just sort of giving you very broad stories here, right? That's the purpose of this lecture. He is assassinated on April 4th of 1968 in Nashville, Tennessee. He comes out of a motel, or is it Memphis? I think it might be Memphis. He comes out of a motel heading to a speech, and he's shot, right? Like literally as he exits the door of his motel. He's on the second floor of a motel, comes out and he's shot dead. He had actually begun to speak out against the war in Vietnam, but that's not really why he's killed. So, Martin Luther King's genius is in understanding the power of imagery. We all know him, of course, though, from his amazing oratory. So let's just watch this little clip on Martin Luther King.
I say to you, as we march, don't panic and remember that we must remain true to nonviolence. I'm asking everybody.
And repeat that. I want to start from the scratch. For those in the room, the speakers weren't up. I want you to just listen to his first sentence or two here that you just missed.
I say to you, as we march, don't panic and remember that we must remain true to nonviolence. I'm asking everybody in the line. You can't be nonviolent, don't get in it. If you can't accept blows without retaliating, don't get in the line. If you can accept it out of your commitment to nonviolence, you will somehow do something for this nation that may well save it.
With a peaceful philosophy and ability to mobilize supporters through eloquent and emotional speeches, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. found his place in the civil rights movement.
His truth is marching on.
It was a Baptist minister's preachings for the power of love that inspired demonstrators to turn their energy toward nonviolent resistance. Though not passive, they were committed to behaving nonviolently when approached or provoked. With a desire to participate on their own, many of the nation's youth initiated student-led demonstrations and developed new strategies of nonviolent protest. At a segregated lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, 4 students began a grassroots movement by defying the law. Known as sit-ins, the movement grew to 70,000 as black and white students across the South took turns sitting at lunch counters whose policy was to serve whites only. This passive resistance to remain seated until served, resistance against years of racial segregation and oppression, led to the desegregation of lunch counters in more than 200 cities. This act is an example of civil disobedience, a peaceful way to object to a law considered unjust. A pattern was emerging within the civil rights movement. It became apparent that the simple presence of new laws wouldn't be enough to assure equality. Efforts from both black and white communities were critical for this goal to become reality. Unfortunately, it didn't happen without bloodshed. As nonviolent protests spread and resistance to desegregation continued, the two forces collided, sometimes violently. And once again, children were on the front lines.
All right, so let's wrap this up in about 6, 7, 8 minutes here. Then we'll take a break for those in the room. But I want to pick up on what you just saw there, these sit-in movements. Again, let me repeat, the genius, and I'll tell you what you need to write down on your slide. Mostly, I just want you to listen to the story here, okay? The genius of Martin Luther King is that he recognized the power of imagery. What he wanted America to see is nonviolent, peaceful black protesters simply asking for equal treatment and being met with the violence that is Jim Crow, right? Did you pick up on that, his first couple of sentences in that video clip? If you cannot take a blow and just deal with it. We don't want you as part of our movement. What he means by that is if you can't take a billy club and not swing back at the whitey, we don't want you as part of our movement. He understood that if blacks were serious about equality, they were only going to achieve it when 87% of the country, the whites, were on board with it. It's just a math game, right? It's just a numbers game. We have 4 classes of students in this building: freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors. If the freshmen want a change in our building, can they make it on their own? No, they're 1/4 of the population of this place. If they really are serious about making a change, they got to get the juniors and seniors in particular, and y'all too, on board. That's how you're going to make a change. And that's what Martin Luther King recognized. We are 13% of the population as blacks. If we want to make a change and end Jim Crow, we need whites on our side. We need whites as part of our cause. And so one of the first groups of people to pick up his call for nonviolence, I don't know why that's doing that, was the sit-in movement. Okay, so let me just find out what I want you to write down here. Okay, there. So let me tell the story of the first sit-in movement again, because this is the kind of stuff Martin Luther King didn't have anything to do with the sit-ins. This is happening on college campuses in North Carolina and spreading outward from there. But it's Martin Luther King's call for nonviolence that inspires this type of response. So here we go. It's North Carolina, right around UNC, University of North Carolina, the Tar Heels. Okay, the first one happens. 4 students go into a local store and offer, order coffee and donuts from a lunch counter. Now, let me give you a concept of a lunch counter. You know how like when you go into, Target, there's like sometimes a Subway or a little pizza station, Pizza Hut station up front, or, a McDonald's in the store. Okay. Back in the 50s and 60s, there were full restaurants in a lot of these big department stores, like a Sears or a Macy's or something like that. They were called lunch counters, and they literally were full service kitchens. You could get breakfast and lunch and dinner there and so on. And they had a counter, okay? And so this is North Carolina in the deep South. It was illegal for blacks to sit at the actual counter of the lunch counter with the stools, right? And just, go up and belly up to the bar kind of thing and sit and ask for coffee or donut. 4 students decide they're going to go and challenge non-violently this silly law. So they go to a Woolworths, which is just think Target. They go to Target and they come up to the lunch counter. They belly up to the bar and they say, "Sir, we'd like a coffee and a donut." And the server, the guy behind the counter, says, "Sorry, you can't sit there. The law doesn't allow you to." And the black students refuse to leave. So I imagine probably the guy calls the manager, right? And says, "Hey, these guys are refusing to leave." The manager convinces them to leave. They walk out the door. They come back just a few minutes later and sit right again in those same seats. And this plays out over the course of a few hours. Eventually, if you're the manager, you just get annoyed by this, don't you? And so what do? You call the cops, because now these students are trespassing, right? Now we got a problem. I can't convince them to leave. They're refusing to leave. Now you call the cops. Cops show up, right? This is day 1 of this whole thing. Cops show up, have no idea how they get these 4 students out, but they do. Then word spreads on campus, and a few hundred students decide they're going to take part in this too. And over the next 5 days, literally, just think like a Monday through Friday, shifts of like 4 black students would walk in, sit at the counter, be refused service, refuse to leave. Somehow they're forcibly removed, and 4 students go in and sit back down. They just keep doing this, right? Well, by day 3, guess who else is there besides the cops? What did I say, Martin Luther King? What? No, we're not federal troops yet. Remember what I said? Martin Luther King's genius is he recognized the power of imagery. Right. Within 3 days of this little thing, news cameras are now showing up. And after 3 days, you can imagine how frustrated the cops and stuff are, right? So how do you think the cops are responding? Are they just saying, "Sir, we need to leave"?
No, they're getting violent.
They're getting violent, right? This is getting old now. And the cops, being racist scumbags at this point in history, begin billy clubbing these student protesters. So now I want you to imagine the power of the image, right? You're Whitey McWhite up in Minneapolis, and you turn on your news, the CBS Evening News, and you see about 4 students who walk into a place they're not technically allowed to be. They sit, do nothing more than simply ask for a coffee and a donut, boom, and dragged out, bloody. And guess what? 4 more go in and sit down, boom, dragged out, bloody. 4 more, boom. This is the first time you've seen the imagery of Jim Crow's violence, right? But this right here is this is what Martin Luther King is calling for. Can you imagine that? I don't know that I would. By day 3, be willing to take a billy club to the head, right? And what does he say? If you can't take the billy club, stay home. We don't want you part of it. 6 months later, lunch counters in North Carolina desegregate, right? Now, this sounds like a small victory, but this is happening. This begins happening all over the place. This is our last slide right here. This like goes viral, right? We use this phrase going viral in our day and age. And what does it mean? It means it goes from this small thing to everybody's talking about it, everybody's doing it. Within a few months, 70,000 students are doing some form of Martin Luther King inspired sit-ins. There are kneel-ins at segregated churches. Can you imagine that? In the house of God, segregation, right? There are wait-ins at segregated beaches. There are read-ins at segregated libraries and sleep-ins at segregated motels and hotels. Remember, by the time we get to the 1950s, almost every aspect of American life in the South is segregated, right? This Martin Luther King inspired, let them see, let Whitey McWhite see it. Let him see with his own eyes the kinds of violence that happens when a Black person goes and attempts to get a book from a whites only library. Boom, billy club, simply for going to borrow a book. Or swimming, putting on swim trunks and going to a whites only beach. And what do you get to see up north? Boom, simply for wanting to go in a beach. For the record, lest you think this is very long ago, I was born in 1976. This is 15 years before I was born, and I'm not that old. I'm 44, right? This is just not that long ago. And what Americans begin to see is the violence that Jim Crow really entails, right? Little Black girl doesn't go to little Black school simply because the law says so. She goes to that Black school in a subservient way because if she doesn't, her family is beaten or worse, right? And this is where we'll stop and we'll pick it up next week because this violence is finally going to come to a head in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. And it will be the tipping point. It'll be the tipping point. In May of 1963, Americans all over will be so outraged at what we see on our news over the course of a month in Birmingham, Alabama, a city so violent at this time, it got the nickname Bombingham for all of the Black church bombings that occurred down there. And in the spring of 1963, Americans will see peaceful Black little protesters, little children, 8, 9, 10-year-old kids going to a playground they're not supposed to play on, and the police chief of Birmingham, Alabama, loosing attack dogs on them or blowing them off the swings with fire hoses. It's that kind of violence that Americans will see. And finally, enough whiteys will get so pissed off at this that there's a nationwide demand for change. And it's in that context that the March on Washington happens, where Martin Luther King gives his famous I Have a Dream speech. So that's where we'll pick it up next week. Those of you watching online, we will see you next week. Enjoy your long holiday weekend, and we'll get together next week.